We realized it was about a 2-year delay and millions of dollars in costs associated with something that was completely unplanned, unanticipated, and was never in the discussion process.
You were on the runway, you were cleared for takeoff, everything was looking good as you're taxiing out. The airport is closed for the next 2 years.
Mehrdad, I'd like to start with you. Previously, you founded and ran Roxwood, where you strategically had planned to exit after getting regulatory approval, but that's not how it played out. Can you tell us about the company and the crisis you faced when you thought you were about to do an acquisition?
Roxwood was a company founded on tools for complex cardiovascular type devices. It was considered somewhat more specialty, couldn't attract quite the typical traditional VCs. And as far as the investors that we got were more individual investors, high net worth, family funds, etc. Kind of lend itself, and we ran the company really more like a small business, and from the get-go, and trying to hustle and trying to make our way through it with the traditional premise of get the products, get it developed, get some initial traction, and attract strategics as for potential acquisitions. For the most part, we had quite a bit of interest, but it was never quite enough to get over the hump. And after about 5 years, where we had generated some good traction, modest but good, solid traction with the products, we'd finally, I think, come to a point where I think we had checked off all the boxes. In this case, particularly with Abbott, which was, one of the biggest players in our field, and had been really the front runner for us throughout. I'd been talking to him the entire 5 years, and as I was with most of them. And finally, with plenty of diligence, having gone through multiple reorgs on their side with their senior management teams, I think all the ducks were aligned and it looked like we were coming together for a deal. And just as that was happening, they announced a acquisition of St. Jude for nearly $30 billion, which put a hold on virtually all other M&A activities, as they mentioned, for the next couple of years. They said, hey, listen, our hands are tied. They said, you were on the runway, you were cleared for takeoff, everything was looking good as you're taxiing out. The airport is closed for the next 2 years. Our apologies. We were left with limited runway, and by now, 5 years in, things were not looking good. And I circled back with them, with Abbott, and they, with me, really, as far as potentially putting together a distribution deal. This is something that we had shied away from. There's a poor track record, I would say, with distribution deals in the Medtech space. And there was a lot of interest, I got to give them credit, to their commercial management team. And we came together and it worked out. As far as them putting in some capital into the company, which was desperately needed, as well as putting the commercial effort behind it to be able to generate that visibility for us, to be able to get some traction in the field. Like I said, we ran as a small company and never hired clinical, never hired marketing. We never had more than 3 or 4 folks in the field. And yet we had, had a breadth of products, and we're desperately looking for that oxygen to really feed the product line to be able to get it out there. And when there was a real commercial strategic, putting commercial effort into it, the products really would do well. As we put it together, it took a while, but on the first month of a soft launch, they opened 50 accounts, which for us was amazing. We had gone from 3 reps in the field to over 200, almost, overnight, relatively speaking, which caused its own crises. Obviously, as you can imagine, operationally, that's maybe for another time, but we were able to hustle our way through it to make that work. Within less than 6 months from starting that distribution deal, we closed an acquisition with a company called BTG, which is now ultimately part of Boston Scientific.
Well, that's a great outcome. What a fantastic pivot to de-risking your market adoption, setting up the distribution agreement deals, and then attracting other buyers when Abbott was off the table. Thank you for that. Now I want to turn to Tom. Tom asked, so a couple years ago, you sold spinal kinetics to Orthofix, but it wasn't a straight path to the exit for you either. Can you tell us about all the challenges you had to navigate?
As John mentioned, I was the CEO and also the founder of Spinal Kinetics. I founded the company in late 2003, and we initiated product development with our first round of funding in early 2004. We submitted, as all companies have to the FDA in 2006. And after that, we hit a number of turbulent events that came on us all pretty much within a 1-year period. I'd like to preface my talk first with the giving a perspective on the FDA between 2004 and 2010. It was one of the most onerous times, and it's well documented from a number of studies that during that time period, the FDA had one of the lowest approval or clearances for 510Ks and PMAs, and the discussions around getting even studies started was very difficult. And that's where we ran into our first problem when we submitted in late summer of 2006 to get PMA or a pivotal trial approval for our PMA. That's when our troubles actually started. We initiated our discussions with them with a submission meetings, et cetera, as most companies do. We made the final submission at the request of the FDA. And then when they actually provided us the approval, they let us know that within the last 48 hours before they gave us the letter, we had to initiate a feasibility trial, which kind of threw us for a loop. But we realized it was about a 2-year delay and millions of dollars in costs associated with something that was completely unplanned, unanticipated, and was never in the discussion process. So we initiated our feasibility study because we didn't really have a choice in March of 2008. And then in September 2008, as we were progressing and we had our interim 6-month report, they came back and threw a bunch more stuff on us, okay? So that extended it even more and cost more. So we immediately said, we got to go fundraising, started our program, got our pitch deck together. But 6 weeks later, after the market crash, we got hit with intellectual property lawsuit from one of the biggest orthopedic companies. I called an emergency meeting with the team, the executive team, and said we have to go through a whole process of crisis management, laying off people. Some of them of the management team would be laid off. And then we have to focus on trying to figure out how to survive. We had about $8.5 to $9 million left in the bank. Our existing investors told us no more money was coming in from them. We knew fundraising from outside was not going to happen. So basically, our future was based on what we could achieve with the money that we had left off. At the end of the day, it just came down, what limbs are you going to cut off to survive? That's the basic decision process we had to go through. And at the end of it, we decided that we were going to lay off more than 50% of the team. We presented that to the board. They accepted. But the biggest thing that we made sure was to communicate and over-communicate to the employees that we would help them get jobs. And one of the things that we did was the management team got on the phone for the next couple of days. And pretty much everybody, the 50% that got laid off, 100% got employed within a month.
Amr, you've been, very successful with the Shifamed model, so much so that you're kind of making medtech startups look easy. But I'm sure this, global pandemic has even been keeping you up at night. What impact has this crisis had on your businesses?
The first thing we had to do was, make sure people were safe and whatnot. So we had everybody work remotely. And certainly, as you can imagine, a lot of engineers can work remotely. And I think that's the experience of probably most of us around how I would leverage Zoom and so forth. So we did that. And then we started sort of keep on pushing in that direction. So we had IT support everybody in their homes. We had engineers bring equipment to their homes, start building stuff there. And that really sort of allowed us to survive, I would say, not thrive, but certainly made up for a lot of otherwise would have been a total disaster. But we were making reasonable progress. We did have to furlough some people. And the next sort of issue that we had to deal with was some of our companies had a specific set of goals. How much money they needed was sort of calculated based on what they intended to accomplish and so forth. So we had to raise money in the middle of the crisis. And we started that process. And then we saw the PPP. We said, oh, this is great. It will save us. We submitted our application, struggled to fight and see if we can get in there. There's a lot of back and forth, and we got it. We said, wait. So we brought people back from furlough. The government is going to help us. We qualified, and everything was great. And then things changed. So when we finally got the PPP money, we exceeded the $2 million threshold. And it's pretty clear that you had to be totally desperate to use that money. The government was going to audit us, and we certainly didn't feel like we were qualified in the rules. So we returned the money. We kept people back on work, but things started to turn around. We reached out to our angel network to raise money for at least one of the companies, and they came through. We talked to our investors, and some of them also came through, and then some new investors came through. So we're actually able to raise some of the monies that we needed to survive. But most sort of important and exciting thing that happened to us is that one of the biggest things that we're really literally had catheters in Paraguay, getting ready to do our first in human for Nevera. This is the ultrasound catheter. And we can't travel anymore, and they're not doing elective procedures. Just literally this Friday, we did our first in human remotely with our support from Zoom. So that's sort of our story. We stuck with it.
By the way, we also applied for PPP and then pulled out once we saw the rules evolve. So Lucira Health is a diagnostic, a molecular diagnostic. So for those who are unfamiliar, that means that we're looking at the genetic material and we're targeting certain gene targets. And the team at Lucira has transformed that technology into a tiny, inexpensive to produce disposable. So it can be used for diagnostics of infections throughout the body, but our target is respiratory. And we were pursuing a home influenza test. So we plan to be on the shelf, and you could go to the drugstore and pick this up, swab not deep in the nose, but in the front of the nose, and know in 20 minutes at home with a digital answer, yes, no, whether or not you have the flu. So we were busy bringing that to market, and then the COVID pandemic came about. We went through a few weeks of should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? And finally, we peeled off a very small group in our assay department, and they went through the bioinformatics and we came up with our own targets on the COVID virus that are proving out to be very reliable so far. So much so that we've shifted the company. So we've done a pivot here now, and we're planning to bring a COVID assay, which will again swab the front of the nose, and in 30 minutes you'll know on the spot. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest. The demand is huge.
That's great. It sounds very exciting. We're all ready for you to get it out there, Erik, so we can go and pick up the test. I'd like to get back to Tom now. Tom, you had to totally pivot with Spinal Kinetics. You got hit by a trifecta of crisis that could sink any one company. You decided to grow revenue. Tell us what happened.
Well, after the reduction in force, and as you mentioned, I think the way we handled it kept the rest of the team in place. So that would have been even a further disaster if we had attrition. But pretty much everybody stayed. We immediately went into stopping the development, just supporting the feasibility trial, and then focused all resources on something that, as I mentioned, we had not intended to do, which was launch in Europe. We immediately started pushing sales, not only in Germany, but started to expand in other countries. By the end of 2010, we had about 5 or 6 countries in Europe that we were covering. The German operation actually became very beneficial for us because we went into an aggressive marketing commercialization mode. In our first year, we did over 8 million in sales. Our margin was about 30%. We went into heavy cost reduction mode for COGS and focused on that. At the beginning of 2011, we were getting into 60, and at the end, mid 2010, we were in the mid 70% gross margins, which all helped us. We actually became cash flow positive in May of 2011 with this process. So cost cutting, focused on commercial sales. By the end of it, we went into over 20 countries. Our sales started to climb at hospital level because in the orthopedic world, you have to pay distributors. We were over 40 million in sales, and that helped save the company pretty much in terms of getting profitability and getting the putting the money into resolving all the legal expenses that we had. So,
wow, that's amazing. So when you had this board meeting and you're going to lay off people 8 million, you probably looked at May 2011 as when it was all going to be over because the cash was going to run out. And instead, you were suddenly making money, cash flow positive, and at that kind of a run rate. That's very impressive. Yeah, well, that was an incredible tenure that you stuck with it, turned it around, and had such a great outcome. Any other thoughts?
Well, one thing I would say is, going through for crisis management, like we had mentioned earlier, it's inevitable. Set up to expect the unexpected. And the reason, we were able to make it through it is to surround yourself with people who have gone through this a bunch and have developed a certain level of scar tissue and are comfortable working in that mode to be able to deal with it. It's hard on everyone.
Everybody doing a startup needs to anticipate that you will hit speed bumps. At the end of the day, it's how you handle those speed bumps is what the team is looking for and the investors are taking a look at. The employees typically that work in startups, they know the risk, but if you're open and sincere with them, they appreciate that. They'll take the bad news and process it and work with you. Making sure that you're very direct and honest with them always comes out in your favor at some point in time. People can deal with bad news if you're honest with them. That's my philosophy.
Well, great, Tom. Thanks for bringing that key point in. I agree with Erik. You need to have investors that understand the space, but even better if they've Tom's saying operational, if they've run a company or two in the space, then they understand what you're going through and they can help you out. Great points. Well, I think we've reached the end of our session, but thanks everyone for your thoughtful contributions. This has been great.